We're looking forward now to our next session, which will be From Data to Action, Can AI Transform Decision-Making for People and the Planet? And to introduce this session, we have an expert speaker with us who is Gayle Smith, former CEO of One Campaign, former coordinator for global COVID response and health security at the U.S. Department of State, and former administrator at USAID. Gayle?
I don't have COVID. As the former coordinator, it'd be like really bad form if I came here. If I did have COVID, I test all the time. I'm recovering from a bit of a chest infection, so it sounds dramatic. I'll just drink some water, but I'm not going to poison you. The second is, I'm not an expert on AI. But I know what I'm talking about on sustainable development and how decisions are made in places where there's power. And I've been around for a while, so longer than I sometimes think anyway, let's not do the numbers. So the way I wanted to think about this was to talk about the potential we have. What is the good in this? What's the danger in this? And what's the imperative? And I will confess from the beginning, I'm an optimistic skeptic. I think there is a lot that can be done in terms of AI being a game-changing technology. I'm skeptical about our collective ability to make the decisions we need to make at the moments we need to make them to make that happen. And therefore, worried a little bit, like if I had to put money on it right now, which I won't because I've worked my entire life in the public sector and the NGO sector, and I don't have enough to risk. I would say there's a really great probability that AI will render the world more unequal rather than more equal. So the challenge, I think, to everybody here is to think about how do we think about this really deliberately. We've got the opportunity now, given the moment we're in. So what's good? What's the game changer? I think about it from my perspective. I worked on HIV/AIDS for decades. I was one of the leads on the Ebola epidemic, and I did nothing but COVID 24/7 for the 2 years that we were all locked up. And I think about things like genomic sequencing, like the ability, and we're already seeing the evidence, that we could know much sooner what a new virus is like COVID. We could know much sooner the ability of that virus to withstand immunities. We could know almost within hours, days, when a new mutation is coming. Now imagine if we had that. Imagine if we had had that during the COVID pandemic. The vaccines could have come out very, 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 very quickly, right? We could have said, you liked Delta, get ready for Omicron. Huge, huge potential there. I think about another good. I come from a world where a lot of what I believe is about change and about impacting decision making is citizen action. I was very proud to be the CEO of the One Campaign. My successor started yesterday, so I'm the former. About a project we did with Google on something called the Data Commons. And basically the premise was, how do we aggregate existing data using AI in such a way that we can put better tools in the hands of citizens? So I'll give you an example of something we did, which was trying to look at all the data on climate, right? We're all worried about climate, and I think a lot of us are trying to get our governments and the decision makers to make the right decisions on climate. Uphill battle. In something that would have taken a year if we were doing research and analysis in the traditional way, we in 3 weeks were able to essentially tame the Wild West of climate data, which is not organized at all, certainly not organized for policy advocacy. and come up with some extraordinary things which are hugely valuable in the hands of citizens. I'll give you an example. We were able to pull all the data to show that 2/3 of the climate money reported to the OECD had never been reported as dispersed, and that much of it actually didn't really have much to do with climate. It was tangentially related, right? You can relate anything to anything else. You put that data in the hands of citizens, and look, I've been in government. I know what it's like to have citizens coming at you and saying, you said this, but it's actually like that. It's hard, but it's necessary. So people can go to their governments and say, excuse me, you're claiming this much has been put into data, including for low-income countries. Here's the data. And people can now generate that by country, by project, by institution. We found that 43% of countries facing a severe debt crisis, that's 60% of low-income countries, are facing a debt crisis as a result of the pandemic, as compared to the fact that the G20 countries were able to spend $14 trillion to protect their economies. Pretty big gulf. Of those countries, we were able to get the data and the documentation to show that those countries are spending more money on paying off debts than they are receiving in financing for climate, including public and private. Now, what does that mean in terms of decision making? It not just empowers citizens to go get really ticked off at a government and protest. It enables citizens to say, this is why this policy is not working, either on debt or on climate, and this is what you need to do. That's a game changer for sustainable development. It has an impact on decision making. Then there's the bad side. I worry a lot that something we all know, and you all know better than I, is that the data that comes out is only as good as the data that goes in. And one of the reasons I'm skeptical and a little bit worried is that we're starting with an exceedingly uneven playing field. We're introducing a game changer into an arena that is grossly unequal. Think about this, for example. We developed vaccines for COVID, right? Global pandemic. We had vaccines. We introduced them into the community, and what happened? Surprise, surprise. People in wealthy countries got vaccinated as much as a year to 14 months before people in poor countries, right? Because you've got an uneven playing field to begin with. We know, I've read some studies that suggest 80 to 85% of AI projects could have some significant error in them because of bias based on gender, race, income, any other factors. What I really worry about is that if we're thinking about low-income countries, I've lived and worked in Africa for much of my life. We had, and I'm sure the team's expanded this since I left one, on this data commons working with roughly 450,000 variables. 14,000 of those came from Africa. Because there's less data being generated and frankly less data being solicited. Because it's easier to go to other places. There's probably more data in this building on a lot of African countries than there is accessibly available in those countries. What does that mean in terms of what we get? At best, it means we get something that reflects the world we live in now, right? Where sort of inequity, structural inequity is kind of the way things are, or we get something that's erroneous. Now, I'm going to get to, okay, so what do we do? I'm not just going to stand up here and complain. Second thing to worry and think about. We talk a lot about machine learning. Like, what about us? What about, like, people learning? I've been in this field for a long, long time. The number of people I have had tell me with the best of intentions that the internet was going to be the solution to ending global poverty. And by the way, mobile telephony is going to completely transform public health. We're going to see an end to AIDS. We're going to see an end to child malnutrition because of mobile phones. Mobile money, it's going to eliminate poor people. That hasn't happened. And I think one of the reasons that hasn't happened is that all those things were seen as silver bullets. And like bullets, that's not the analogy we want. Like bullets are things you shoot at people. We want tools. We haven't viewed these things as tools. We viewed them too quickly as silver bullets or solutions. And if it's a tool, I go to one of you and say, what problem are you trying to solve? And how can this tool be applied? As opposed to saying, I've got this silver bullet here, and if I just aim it in your direction, everything will be solved. So how do we think about that? How do we think about where do the solutions start is one thing. I think in the case of the internet, somebody who was an early player in the evolution and expansion of the internet, and then a very successful business person and all of it, once said to me he'd been to a conference about the future of the internet, and I said, well, what are your findings? And he said, we all built this thing and we all got excited about it, and we never talked about how to turn it off. And I think about AI the same way. How do we think about planning for risk now? I think we can anticipate what a lot of the risks are. We're seeing a lot of the risks unfold. How do we plan for that now? Because right now this is a downside. The last one is on definitions, and I think you'll hear in the panel, it's really important you don't hear this from me because I'm not the expert. In the case of other major technologies being introduced that could have a huge impact on sustainable development, and don't get me wrong, they've had some impact, but they're not the solution. Definitions are key. And I find I'm in an increasing number of conversations, and people use the term AI kind of like, if you say NGO, okay, I'm an NGO, the National Rifle Association is an NGO. There are major healthcare operations that are, and NGOs is just something that's outside of government. So what definitions are we talking about? And I hope in the panel we can break that down a bit. So where do I want to take this in the end? And this is a bit my plea, and I hope it will be helpful to our discussion. I think the game changer is and could be that AI could play a fundamental role in making the world more equitable. And I don't say that just because I think it would be nice if the world was more equitable. I think it would be just and right. But it would work a whole lot better if it were more equitable. And so what are the things we need to think about, even as we're making decisions now? One, and I've said this, is that we need to think about this as a tool and not a solution. Tools can help solve problems, but we've got to remember in any problem we're trying to solve, decision we're trying to make, human beings are involved. I have a lot more respect for the IMF today under Kristalina Georgieva than I did some years ago. And my frustration with the fund back in the day was they always talked about economies and here's all the solutions and the things you can do, as though human beings don't live in those economies. Right? Development is fundamentally about human beings and dynamics and systems and how those interact. So how do we think about it as a tool? How do we balance some of the disparities we already have? Are there not initiatives? I mean, you listen to Yusuf on what Rwanda is doing. Not every country is doing that. But aren't there some things we can do very quickly to level the playing field so that before we introduce this magic wand, we've got greater equity? The third, and on decision making, is it's all about who's at the table. A friend of mine from Nigeria, and I don't know whether this is her line or she stole it from someone else, but it's a good one. She always says that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think one of the things we need to think about, look, I've been in government. We consult other people. I think the tech community is doing a better job of reaching out to people who may be impacted or from whom they want views with an eye to empowerment. But we don't put those people at the table. Users are not at the table when we're talking about how to deal with this technology. So we got to think hard. Who's at the table when we're making these decisions? And what's the difference between consulting and including? And could we learn some lessons we haven't about the impact of the internet on global equality and inequality if we did that? The last thing I would say is this, is that development is all about access. It's access to this tool, it's access to the decision making, it's access to the data that we've heard so much about. So my hope is that in these discussions, because there is so much potential here, we will ask ourselves at every single point whether we want a policy change, whether we want to put a solution on the table, whether we want to decide on rules and regulations for the future. Start with access. Because who has access and how is going to determine whether in the end AI makes us a better, safer, and more equal world, or I will leave the bad side to you, one where we face a whole lot more turmoil. So no pressure, but I'd be really grateful if y'all could take some of these questions and think about them as we proceed. And now I think we're going to move to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayle. And with that, I'm very happy to introduce our panel. So joining us today, we will have Samuel Annim. Samuel Annim is the government statistician from the Ghana Statistical Service. And with Sam, we will also have Laura McGorman, who's the Director of AI for Good at Meta. And online, we have Sally Radwan, who's the Chief Digital Officer at the United Nations Environment Program. And just to remind everyone that we do have our viewers on YouTube, and we see a lot of great discussion going on in the chat, so happy to have you guys still with us. And we will also be taking questions from the YouTube chat. So. Brian Fung is our moderator for this session. Brian is a technology reporter at CNN, and Brian is also my childhood friend and a former Berry Day camper. So send your kids to camp because they might find themselves on a panel one day at the World Bank.
Thanks, Audrey. Everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I want to pick up maybe where you left off, Gayle, talking about definitions. And, I think when we talk about AI, there's, as you said, a lot that goes into that term. And when you look at sort of where we've come on AI, it's really, we've seen quite a lot of development in the last, 10 years, but it really goes on back beyond that. And, I wonder if, Laura, you might start by talking a little bit about what we've done in the AI space, because it's not just the use of large language models, but we've also seen the use of machine learning and computer vision. Talk about some of the technology that powers this revolution.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here today to speak about this. I think, Gayle, I could not agree more that the importance of definitions is really key here, because I think one of the reasons we're here today and the whole conference is focused on AI is because of the explosion of large language models and generative AI over the last year or so. But if we take a walk down memory lane, artificial intelligence, which I would define as using computers to make predictions in the simplest terms. So data in is one piece of the puzzle, and that data could be in numeric form, it could be in text form. And then using math to identify patterns in that data to tell us things that that data can't tell us on its own. So to make predictions in the absence of the training data itself. And so if we think about the explosion of large language models, which really are just our management teams refers to it as these large autofill models that you're predicting the next word in a sentence based on troves and troves of text data from across the internet. That same predictive power has been behind many different types of models since the 50s. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence, I certainly hope we won't restrict ourselves to conversations around large language models or generative AI, which, the way you define generative AI is that it makes content. So it could make a paragraph or a sentence, or it could make an image. Because I think those applications in the development context are very exciting, are novel. But if you think about things like you mentioned, Brian, computer vision. So how can you identify something in an image? I think in the context of development, the things that can be identified from satellite imagery alone have extremely powerful applications in the development context. So I hope that we don't get caught up in the hot topic that are large language models and generative AI, because they do have a lot of promise, but they've been around for about a year. And we have many decades of use in artificial intelligence for development applications to draw from that I think are just as relevant, if not more so, to today's conversation.
Yeah, so Laura, as I hear you talking, it really seems like there's kind of two buckets we're talking about. One is just machine analysis of large data sets, right? And then the other is the use of generative AI to create new things. And so Samuel, I might turn to you next and just ask you to talk a little bit about how you're applying artificial intelligence, both in the sort of machine learning context as well as the generative AI. And then Sally, I'll come to you with the same question.
Thank you very much, Brian, and good afternoon. Let me touch on the definition a little bit before I get into what we're doing in Ghana. And I very much associate with what you said. We in Ghana about 3 years ago were clear in our minds what artificial intelligence is, alongside what data science is, alongside what big data is. And we decided that as an office, we use 3 words to characterize artificial intelligence, and we called it the Khan agenda, which simply means that everybody should think about change, everybody should think about automation, and everybody should think about novelty in whatever we are doing. The other thing that I want us to also reflect on, which partly came up in this morning's discussion, is which part of AI do we want to think about? And I'm happy this morning in the midst to talk about the computer aspect of it, the data aspect of it, and the algorithm part of it. For us in Ghana, we don't think we need to worry so much about the generative part of AI because, as was said earlier, on the capacity side, the infrastructure side, we don't have to really be part of that conversation in pushing it forward since we can easily onboard it. The 2 things that we need to think about is the adaptation part of it, and more concerning, Gayle, is what you talked about in terms of the redistribution effect of it. Unfortunately, when we talk about the redistribution effect of it, a lot of us think about it from the perspective of resource inequality, income, and so on and so forth. But in our minds, what AI is doing for us as a country from a redistribution point of view is roles and responsibilities across all the stakeholders within the national statistical system. And within the national statistical system, from an AI point of view, this is the time we need to ask ourselves whether national statistical systems are very well knit with the policy environment or are knit to the public environment that you talked about. And this is where we think that we need to invest a lot of the conversation. I mean, I was talking to Johannes and Francois why we don't see the policymakers in this space and why the public is not in this space. National statistical offices can really onboard data science, can really onboard AI, but if we continue living in an era where we are not responding to the question that Gayle asked, before AI, what was the challenge? Before AI, the challenge was the disconnect between data and policy. And this is the advantage we need to take up with this AI system and make sure that we can better connect data and policy so that in a conversation like that, we ask ourselves, are national statistical offices doing certain basic things of telling the alternate stories around different data that we have. National statistical offices have been very restrictive because we say that what is official statistics, this is your inflation, this is your unemployment, this is your GDP. And all of us in this room are aware that every data that you see, every statistics that you see have alternate stories and policy insights to it. And in our mind, this is what AI should do. AI should be able to tell us all the alternate stories with every statistic that we have and get policymakers to say that, okay, these are the risks associated with the 10 policy options that we have with these statistics. And by so doing, we can get better connected to it. That is why in Ghana, we are doing two things. We are taking up the evaluation of sectoral and national policies very well. And in our minds, AI can easily do this because every nation, every national statistical office can go to the website, see the policy documents, and do some assessment of it. And what we've done recently from the perspective of AI is to empower the public more with data. So the whole of last year, we did what we call the hackathon, which, by the way, I'm happy to mention that Ghana emerged the winners of the 2023 UN Datathon, just because as the National Statistical System, we wanted to make sure that through AI, the public would hold policymakers accountable. So if we step back and reflect on the data revolution that we talked about ahead of the SDGs, we would better place AI in the context of better connecting data, policy, and the public. Thank you.
Samuel, can you give some more examples of when you talk about, using AI to tell different stories with the data that you have? Do you first, can you give some more examples of that? But then also, do you see that as being a function of using different models, or do you see that as being, the responsibility of the statistical offices to, think creatively about how to present the data that they have?
I would say both. And one of the things that I was reflecting on, you all would know that in the last 5 years, we've been talking about non-traditional data sources. Really, with the conversation of AI, we should start talking about non-traditional analytics, so that we look at the conversation not from only the production side, but the outputs of the data that we have. I always want to distinguish between a statistical input and a statistical output. And what I mean by a statistical output here is the non-traditional analytics that I'm talking about. A number of us as NSOs continue to rely on the standard approaches. Let me give you a classical example. Following the conduct of the 2021 population housing census in Ghana, we realized that about a third of the population is 6 years and older, cannot read and write in any language with understanding. So when this conversation of AI came up, I asked myself, if I go to policymakers, what do I tell them? Do we invest more in a third of the population who cannot read and write in any language with understanding, or we're going to use AI to demonstrate the link between this statistic of about a third of people who cannot read and write with understanding and how that is linked to our maternal mortality ratio, which is way above the SDG goal of 70 per every 100,000 live births. We're currently doing about 301 deaths for every 100,000 live births. And this is what we don't do as traditional statistical offices. And this is what I mean by non-traditional analytics, where we can pick different statistics like illiteracy, maternal mortality, and answer that question why Ghana's development has been fluctuating. So this is the kind, we need to move away from one statistic per issue is enough. And that is what AI should help us to do.
That's fascinating. Sally, I wonder if you might be able to talk next about what you're seeing and hearing and doing at the UN, and maybe if there are any particularly creative uses of AI that you're seeing, kind of like what Samuel was talking about.
Great, thank you, Brian, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those online as well. I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry, I couldn't be there in person, but very happy to be here, and particularly grateful actually for Gayle's opening speech, because it's given us a lot of pointers and things to follow up on. So at the UN, and specifically at the UN Environment Program where I work, we tend to look at digital technologies, and of course, especially now AI, always from the two sides of the coin, as we call them. So on the one hand, we look at the opportunities that it affords, and I'll give a few examples of those, but crucially also the downside, the environmental specific and how we can minimize it, and how we can make them more environmentally responsible. So talking about the opportunities, I tend to categorize things into maybe two buckets a little bit. One is what I call point solutions. And I think Laura, I think it was, talked about the definition of AI and how it's actually not just generative AI, but machine learning. I'd actually go a couple of steps before that and say it's not necessarily data-driven AI and data-driven methods, but it's also symbolic AI and root AI and all these kinds of things that we need to import back into the equation because they've been ignored for so long and they are really crucial to complement the picture. So when we talk about point solutions, these are very specific things, very specific problems that AI can help us solve. And at UNEP, we have, for example, two things. One is a pilot. I will have to start with large language models. So this is our own large language model for the environment. It's called Environment GPT. It is based on ChatGPT or GPT 3.5, I should say. And what it does is it aims to combat misinformation and disinformation about environmental topics, particularly about climate change, but we're also expanding it to other parts of the environment now. So what it does differently from the normal ChatGPT is that it doesn't hallucinate because it was trained on a very specific and well-curated corpus of knowledge that is sanctioned by UNEP. The other thing is when it gives you an answer, it also gives you a reference. So it tells you where that answer came from with chapter and verse, as it were. So giving you the exact link. And if it has two conflicting answers, which often happens in environmental science, then it will also give you both points of view with both references, which helps in verifying information. So this is currently in pilot stage, and we're transforming it into a production grade product. The other one is what we call the IMEO, which is the International Methane Emissions Observatory. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's an AI-enabled tool that helps us track hotspots for methane emissions around the world. And it's got an early warning and alert system attached to it, which actually sends early warning signals to governments. So we've trialed this successfully, for example, with the government of Argentina, where we were able to detect a methane hotspot that was going to cause problems, and the early warning was sent to the government, who were able to put in place their mitigation plans. So these are, and there are many more examples, but these are what I call point solutions. What I'm really excited about when we talk about AI for sustainable development is more holistic solutions. Right now, they're a little bit called multimodal solutions or multimodal AI when it comes to generative AI. I'm sure you've heard the next generations of GPT and transformer models will be trained on different kinds of data, so not just text, but text and sound and images and everything else. In the environment domain, we look at this a little bit differently. So it's not just text, but it's sensor data, it's of course satellite images, it's in situ data, it's citizen science data, it's many different kinds of data sources and formats and types that come in to help you form a holistic picture. This can be in the form of a digital twin, and I'm sure you've all heard of many digital twin technologies that are starting to emerge. At UNEP, what we are currently doing is something called the World Environment Situation Room, where we try to collect all of these different data types and combine them to form pictures of the environment on Earth. This can be a country-based profile, so the state of environment in country X. It can also help us build future scenarios, so predictions for how climate change might affect different things, and this is where this holistic view of data comes into play, because you need to not only look at the environment, but also the effects of the environment on socioeconomic variables, on human migration, on population health and disease, and so on and so forth. And so it's those linkages that have really been facilitated by taking this multimodal approach. Of course, also to plan ahead for projects, so to calculate the potential impact of certain policy interventions before you put them in place. And what happens if, for example, we're looking to change 500 buses from diesel to hydrogen fuel versus if we increase that number to 1,000? What's the marginal impact or improvement get on different environmental variables and so on? To do that, of course, we need a couple of enablers in place, and one of the enablers is, of course, data. So one thing we're working on is something called the Global Environmental Data Strategy, which we're putting forward a number of pillars to work on, including the interoperability of environmental data globally, the quality, that includes machine readability, but also the actual quality and classification of environmental data, governance, access, including equal access, of course, and capacity building. I'll stop there. I can elaborate more on other aspects, but let me stop here.
So I think this leads into a really good question about how we think about the data that goes into these models. And I think we spent a long time in the last session, exploring how this explosion of technology could really be an opportunity for us to rethink how we think about data and how we build data sets and how we structure data and how we get data to interoperate with each other. And so I just put this kind of question to the whole panel: how do you think artificial intelligence may reshape the way that we think about building these large data sets and how we interact with them? Sure. Yeah, Laura.
So I really appreciate the comments thus far, and I think we've been talking a lot about inequities associated with artificial intelligence. People have been using the more diplomatic way of framing, garbage in, garbage out, which any good statistician will tell you. And so I care very much, and I think anyone who works in this space does, about making sure that we have access to good training data. And at the same time, what I feel really hopeful about is that sometimes, we focus a lot on the inequities that exist in the status quo, which, Gayle, you referenced, but how artificial intelligence could actually create more equitable views of the world, because if you use models built on top of things like satellite imagery, you're not beholden to the same methodologies as a typical survey design. And so one example that I can think of is these AI-powered poverty maps that our team has built that are called the Relative Wealth Index. And many people at the bank have actually used them. But the sort of process of development for these tools was that we took the world's worth of satellite imagery, and we were able to use, this is going to sound very wonky, but computer vision and convolutional neural networks, aka AI, to identify features in the satellite imagery that might be predictive of wealth. So to use a very clear example, here in Washington, D.C., if you live close to a metro, you're going to pay more for your apartment. Same actual finding aggregates across the world. If you live closer to roads and bridges in Senegal, you're more likely to be wealthy. You're more likely to be poor if you live in a rural setting very far away from infrastructure. We train an AI model using gold standard population data sets, in this case, the demographic and health surveys, which are run by USAID. And we are able to then combine the DHS training data with the findings from the artificial intelligence model, as well as connectivity data, because Meta has a lot of that. So think of how many mobile phones are in an area, what's the strength of cellular networks. And we're able to predict where poor people live at levels of granularity that you cannot do with survey data alone. So everyone knows, good statisticians in the room, you're only able to sample so many people. And so your actual level of resolution in a household survey might be the county level or even the state level. Using AI, you can predict the number of people who live in a 1.2 kilometer grid tile. Now, what does this mean for, actually providing services to very poor people? So in the case of Togo, the National Novisi program, which stands for Solidarity, which got funding from the bank to deliver unconditional cash transfers to the poorest of the poor. They were able to reach thousands and thousands of more people using the big data approach and the AI-driven targeting system because they were able to target really small areas. So you weren't able just to say this entire region was eligible to apply for this cash transfer program, but that this neighborhood could. And so I do think that there's a lot of promise when we think about making sure for sure that the training data that goes in to build artificial intelligence powered maps and tools, making sure that's quality training data, but then when you can increase the resolution and increase sometimes the availability of more timely data, you can actually increase equity by using an AI powered tool.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I mean, let me come in from the perspective of data for artificial intelligence, and let me indicate that different countries are onboarding again data science, artificial intelligence, big data from different perspectives. Globally, we need to begin to think about how we can have different frameworks of onboarding all these things so that we can have some comparability across different national statistical systems. In Ghana, as I indicated earlier on, we have a data science roadmap. And from the perspective of data for artificial intelligence, we said to ourselves that, again, go back to the 2014 arguments of the data revolution ahead of the SDGs. And the first thing that it talks about has to do with transparency and accountability. So if we sit here after 6-7 years and we're saying that it's difficult for AI to access data, and we've not empowered or have a common infrastructure to ensure that countries have their own statistical online banks, where they pull data from all different sources so that we all know that this data that is being used for any model that we're talking about is coming from one central source. This is a case where, as was said earlier on, we still see a number of developing countries coming to the World Bank for data that has been standardized for all developing countries. When national statistical offices can easily have that infrastructure for a statistical online bank, which will be the basis for transparency and the basis for data that will inform any model that we are doing. So if you come to our statistical online bank, we have the demographic and health survey sitting there. We have a 20-year running annual school census data sitting there. We have the 2021 population and housing census sitting there. All the data from the central bank, and for now, development partners that have thought of aligning with us, their data sitting there. And because we said earlier on that the only way we can solve all these problems is our ability to integrate that. From my point of view, the strength of artificial intelligence model will start from that basic infrastructure. When, as every nation, we don't have to rely on the World Bank, the IMF, to have data that has been standardized across all countries, but you can really get your context-specific issues.
Fascinating. Anyone else want to chime in on that? No? Okay. I want to open it up to audience questions. So feel free to approach the mic at any time. Please introduce yourself, and please make sure to ask a question. And to keep it short, please. I will cut you off if you're running long. And while you're thinking of questions to ask, I do want to offer one more question to the panel, which is, Gayle, you spoke about a lot of the mistaken assumptions that we made about technology in the past. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what mistaken assumptions we might be making about AI now, and what kind of mistaken assumptions about technology you think have kind of persisted, to today.
Sure. Well, I think you just gave a very good example of one. It's where do we go for the data? And I think one of the things, since just before the SDGs were agreed and right after, my God, it was the data revolution. There were more data organizations, banks, initiatives launched than you can imagine. And I think this thing about if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, it's kind of where you sit is where you stand. And so I think one lesson we haven't learned as much is going to the source. I'll give you an example. As aid administrator, and before that I was in the White House at the NSC, and I had responsibility for major humanitarian disasters. It's worse now, but there were 15 or 20 and epidemics and so on and so forth. And there was very, very good discussion going on amongst donors and a lot of the tech industry about how we could use data and the internet to revolutionize disaster response and crisis response. It never included people who are affected by disasters or people who were the responders on the ground. And I think there's sort of a feeling that at worst people do that as a box checking. At best it's sort of like, oh yeah, we'll learn something interesting. It's more structural than that. It's much more structural than that, because the problem we're trying to solve, or the opportunity we're trying to seize, is in Ghana. And I've lived in Africa for a long time. I got no business defining, I can assist in that. So I think one is, how do we go to the source and push back on a very good tendency to say, and this happens in the development field all the time, I want to bring you a solution. It means genuinely, how do we pair these things up from the ground floor, right? And by the way, if we do that on the data and where we're getting the data, we can help strengthen central statistical agencies, which Ghana's got a handle on it, Rwanda's got a handle on it. It's very uneven in different countries, and you want that as an institutional base. So I think one is going back to the source. The second one is, and this is probably naive to say, but governance in all of this is a train wreck, right? I think we'd all agree. That's an official diplomatic term I learned in government. Because we're talking regulation, we're talking about politics, who imposes it on who doesn't. I think another lesson to take, I think there are more people in positions of influence and power that want to see tools like this change the world for the better than there are people who just want to make a ton of money or who don't really care, right? We didn't, in the case of the internet, get those people together across sectors to say, what are the solutions? We could do that this time, right? We don't have to each go into somebody's going to go into a government camp and figure out what kind of regulation we need to put on these guys, go into the tech industry and say, what kind of things do we want to do, but we want to be careful of because we don't want to be overregulated. We can bring all those players together at the front end. And we didn't do that. And I think we're not doing it yet. I mean, look, one of the things you learn when you're in government is that you kind of think there's this government, these institutions, they're all so powerful. And then you get in there and you say, oh, it's us. Right? Like, where's the meeting? This is the meeting. And I think it's the same in this case. And I think what we do with these big technologies, whether we're citizens, industry, government officials, practitioners, we sort of cede the ground to others rather than we can take the initiative to get the right people in the room and dominate the field and shape it. Is that idealistic? It's no more ideal. Yeah, but idealism is good. Like, if we don't have idealism, then we're cynical and we just wait for this to happen to us. And I think we know enough that if we wait for this to happen to us, we're going to get a ton of really good projects. It'll be fantastic. Individual cases, communities or countries that do extraordinary things that will impact people's lives. We are not going to get systematic change. And I think that's what we need. I also know, and I don't want to belabor the point except that I sort of do, which is if we don't take that initiative, it won't happen. So, conspire. Get all the right people in the room and lay out the terms, because nobody knows what the terms should be yet, right? Nobody's figured this out.
Anyone want to chime in on that? We have a question in the audience here. And feel free to just approach the mic. You don't need me to call on you.
Great. Can I?
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Great.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Peter Adu from the French Development Agency. Thanks, Gayle, for all the things that you've talked about and stressing on the need for citizens' engagement or participation. I think is a very important aspect of moving from data to action. This is just a recommendation I would like to put also on the table. I think framing the questions that matter in the local context is extremely very important. So, for instance, if countries outline, let's say, what are the top, 10 key questions per sector because we're talking about policies, but we have to move policies to action. So, given a particular sector, what are the top 10 questions that we can leverage data to be able to address these particular questions, and then collaborate with the national statistical institutions, public sector, and other stakeholders to be able to address this question. I think that will also help in moving forward. So that's my recommendation on that. And then the second part, I think Samuel was talking about non-traditional data, which is extremely important, especially in regions where survey data is about 10 years old. I was working on Sahel data, and sometimes you have 10 years or above, and you want to make timely interventions in these particular areas. We rely on non-traditional data. With the uprise and growth of ChatGPT and generative AI and all these movements, we do have the internet polluted with AI-generated content. How do we ensure the reliability of some of these non-traditional data that we extract online? Thanks.
That's a great question. Does anyone want to take that? How do we deal with the rise of false and fake content?
I mean, I think that one of the things that's important to remember is that as much as, AI, if you're talking about generative AI, can create new content, it's really important to remember that AI is an indispensable tool for the actual policing of harmful content and misinformation. So at Meta, if we didn't have AI at our disposal, it would be much, much harder to enforce our community standards. And one very concrete example is that the prevalence of hate speech on our platform is down by 50-60% over the last 2 or so years because of advances in artificial intelligence. And so it's now basically 2 out of every 10,000 pieces of content on our platform might be something along the lines of hate speech, which is way, way down because of improvements in our artificial intelligence. And I also think that no matter what the content source, we're going to police it the same way. So whether or not there's a deep fake that is harmful to people because it's hateful or it is inaccurate in terms of the information, or it's something that's generated by a human, I'm not really sure that matters. What matters is that a piece of content is harmful. And so enforcement systems powered by AI should treat that content the same, and they do. And so I just think about potentially the volume of that content increasing, but the enforcement hopefully moving just as fast, if not faster, because of the power of AI to actually police that content.
Gayle, did you have something to say?
Yeah, we'll pass this back to you, but I think that's right, but I don't think we're doing enough on the front end on this, because I look a lot at what is coming back from just as a user. I would use AI on vaccines, and it's not coming back with the facts. It's coming back with 85% fact and about 15% scientifically documented bullshit. And right now we are seeing measles outbreaks all over the world because people are not getting their kids vaccinated because of false information on vaccines. So I think the question is, and I know it's really hard to build these screens that stop this, but how do we move that faster? Because my fear is that the 15% is going to probably go to 20 or 25. And if we've got 25% misinformation on basic health, then we're in a world of trouble in terms of what we're projecting in terms of the viral threats we're going to face. So again, I come back to a couple things. One, and if AI is a tool of this, I'd actually never thought of that, but as you say, it's kind of obvious that it's a very powerful tool there. How do we sequence this? Do we need to ramp that up first? Or is that something that catches up with us as we go along? So how do we sequence it to really make it work?
One of the concerns that I have is, as the AI industry moves ever faster, does some of this false information end up, becoming part of the training sets for future models? And then that just sort of compounds the problem and we can't undo it. And so when we kind of talk about that problem or some of the problems associated with generative AI, to what extent do we think that that's going to make it harder for national statistical offices or governments to actually achieve their development goals?
I mean, let me go back to a couple of things that my colleague Yusuf talked about. And for national statistical offices, I think we are clear in our minds when it comes to how to deal with data that is not true, data that cannot be verified. And that is why we are calling for a central data repository that whatever you want to do with AI, we should know where it is coming from. And as he clearly indicated, countries have moved on to the point that you know what an official statistics is, what an experimental statistics is, and as he said, what an operational statistics is. In Ghana, we don't say operational, we just say it's unofficial. What that simply means is that it's any number that is out there that one cannot follow through the entire processes to validate it. But otherwise, in the context of data that is abundant, from a methodological point of view, I think it is pretty straightforward. We could do either source validation or methodological validation to really get a sense of the extent of reliability of the data that we have. So from a statistical point of view, I think it's clear in our mind. If you permit me, let me touch on something that Peter talked about. And I think this is very critical from the perspective of the data policy, public engagement that I talked about. Still, a number of national statistical systems in the global south only produce statistics that are internationally required, which doesn't feed into the context that we're talking about. And this is where we are saying that it's about time that we think about AI from that perspective in terms of what do we think our topmost challenges are, how can we get the policymakers, the public, to at any point in time demand certain kind of statistics from the general public. And I make this point very strongly. If you rely on national statistical offices to determine the statistics that you want for your country, your statistics will be moving in one direction and the policies, the statistician policies will be moving in another direction. And this is how we need to think about AI. AI as a means of connecting the three key stakeholders, the national statistical system, the policymakers, and the public. Thank you.
We're just about out of time, but we do have one question from the stream, so I wanted to read that out. Gayle, you mentioned the need to consider who's at the table and who has the power when it comes to AI and decision making. What do you see as key strategies for bringing more voices to the table to promote a more equitable use of AI for good? And then also, I would put that same question to Samuel and to Sally as well. As you're thinking about implementing the use of some of this technology in your own work.
Yeah, look, some years ago, when the 2007, 2008, the global economy was going through a convulsion, the world created the G20. We say it's good, bad, or otherwise, but we created an institution. My thought on this would be, should we not be thinking about creating a something, a G something, not necessarily just governments though, because I think to your point, there's a common thread throughout this of sort of the data, the science, the decision makers, and the citizenry. Like none of it rests solely in one camp, and then you add the whole industry. There is no place to go for this, and none of our international institutions or forums were built for, I think, what's necessary to start looking at governance and making sure that there are more people at the table and fewer people on the menu. Because again, you're going to look at a body of just governments, that's not going to work. A body of just industry, that's not going to work. A body that has no users, and I don't just mean users in the sense of individual users, but the people who are trying to use this to solve specific problems. I would create that. And who takes the initiative? Government can take the initiative. The tech industry could take the initiative. It can start as an informal entity. But I think this is a case when we think about how big decisions are made in governance. If you look at after World War II, it was key people from governments getting together and saying, what institutions do we need to govern the next 50 years and steer the world out of this era into the next one? I think the difference now is we need that same kind of steering and leadership. It can't just be government. We don't have it. I think we need to take the initiative to create it and not to control it. Because if somebody, we set up something and everybody's sort of self-appointed, that's bad. That's not going to work. But if there is an institution that includes all of the key stakeholders on an equal footing, not like because you're a big tech company, you got more juice, or your government, you got more juice than a low-income country or somebody representing citizens and users, to start pushing out solutions. We can get governments to adopt them. But if we wait for governments to come up with the solutions to all of this, to the governance, or the tech industry to come up with, it's going to fall behind the development of the technology.
Yeah. Samuel and Sally, any thoughts on how to involve non-traditional stakeholders in all of this?
I think it's good to mention that there is, and Jenna is here, we have the ongoing national data partnerships, which is happening in a number of countries, that is trying to bring together all those sitting around the table so that they are not on the menu. The most important thing we really need to reflect on is the potential different data sources that are helping us address different challenges. The issue of private sector held data has come up quite a number of times, but what we've not reflected on is how we can make it attractive for the private sector in terms of the work that we do as national statistical offices, of what importance are our products to the private sector. One of the narratives that we are changing strongly in Ghana is that our major target is not the policymaker. It's clear in our mind that now our major target is the public and the media. And once that narrative changes, we go. The issue of policymakers coming on board and sitting around the table will be seamless. But unfortunately, a number of statistical offices continue to service mostly policymakers rather than the public and the media. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Sally, in just our final minutes here, will you round us out?
Sure. So there's one on governance, and so there's, maybe some of you are aware of this, there's a huge effort going on at the UN at the moment under the Secretary General's direct supervision to kind of research or explore the possibility of creating some sort of global AI governance structure. This is much needed because it does have the goal of involving all stakeholders, so general public, academia, private sector, crucially, etc., and also because I'm really, really worried about the fragmentation of governance, whether for data or for AI. And I'm worried that it's, the race for governance itself is turning into a little bit of a gold rush like the race for AI. So it's turned into these competing entities that have, once you start talking about AI governance, it's, we already have our AI governance structure, and every private company will tell you that. We have our own internal guidelines and we're following them and they're fantastic. But no one knows what they are. They're not interoperable. They don't speak necessarily to all stakeholders who are going to use those systems. So a lot of consolidation and bridge building is definitely needed there. The final point I'll end with, and it goes a little bit to what Gayle said about involving the general public and also about definitions. So I'm now hopefully just finalizing my PhD, and it's on AI, specifically AI explainability. And explainability is one of these wishy-washy terms that no one was really able to define. Again, different bodies will tell you, oh, we define it as this, we define it as that, but there's not one single definition that everyone agrees on. Yet every single policy document on AI that you read will have explainability as AI systems need to be explainable. And no one knows what that is. No one has actually gone out and asked the users, what do you expect when you talk about explainability? So what that ends up creating is a rift between the technical community, and Laura will know this from Meta because some of the big technical leads at Meta are actually very skeptical about this whole explainability thing. It can't be done, it's too complex and no one needs it anyway. But actually, when you talk to the actual users, the general public and the domain experts and people who need that explainability, they'll tell you that what they need is not for the algorithm to output what it's doing every step of the way. They need completely different things. They need to understand where your training data came from. They need to understand who you involved in the development of the algorithm or the model. They need to know details about certification, about testing, about past performance, and about similar cases to the one that they're looking at now. So it's a completely different set of expectations, but you only get those insights when you speak to the end users. And that doesn't necessarily need to be in traditional, round table discussions. We need to have everyone at the table. The table can also be research that academia can do. We need more social science research into AI, and for those results to flow into the policy-making vehicles so that we're gathering user input that way as well.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on. Thank you, Sally. And please join me in thanking this panel of wonderful experts.